The moment my ex-husband made my mother cry was the moment he unknowingly changed his own future. I still remember the sound of laughter echoing across the restaurant that evening, the kind of forced laughter people use when they are uncomfortable but too afraid to speak up. My mother stood near the end of the long table, holding a small glass of sparkling cider as she thanked everyone for coming to celebrate her 65th birthday. The private dining room overlooked the river, and warm lights reflected against the water outside. It should have been one of the happiest nights of her life. Instead, it became a memory none of us would ever forget. My name is Claire Bennett, and if you had asked me that night what hurt the most, I would have said it wasn't the insult itself. It was watching my mother try to smile through it. Jason, my ex-husband, sat across the room with his new girlfriend beside him. He looked completely at ease, leaning back in his chair as though he owned the place. Even after our divorce, he had somehow remained connected to many of the same social circles, and when he heard about my mother's birthday gathering, he had found a way to get invited through mutual friends. I hadn't wanted him there, but my mother believed in being polite. She always believed people would eventually show their better side. Unfortunately, Jason rarely did. The evening had gone smoothly at first. Family members shared stories. Old photos appeared on a projector screen. My father even told a joke that made everyone laugh. For a brief moment, I thought we might get through the night without any problems. Then someone asked my mother how retirement was treating her. She smiled and admitted that she still worked part-time at the local library because she enjoyed staying active. Before anyone else could respond, Jason let out a chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Heads turned toward him. He raised his glass and said, "Some people never learn how to stop struggling, I guess." A few guests exchanged awkward looks. My mother gave a polite smile and tried to move the conversation forward. But Jason wasn't finished. "Honestly," he continued, "that's the difference between people who build success and people who spend their lives chasing it." The room fell quiet. I felt my stomach tighten. My father stared at his plate. My younger cousin looked down at the tablecloth. Everyone understood exactly who Jason was talking about. My family had never been wealthy. We worked hard. We paid our bills. We helped one another. But in Jason's eyes, those things had never been enough. During our marriage, he constantly compared my family to people with bigger houses, bigger bank accounts, and more impressive job titles. I thought the divorce would end that behavior. I was wrong. My mother attempted to laugh it off. "I've had a good life," she said softly. "That's what matters to me." Jason shook his head. "Maybe. But imagine how much easier life would have been if your family had thought bigger." A few people nervously laughed again. Others looked horrified. I watched the color drain from my mother's face. Her eyes dropped toward the floor. She blinked several times as though fighting back emotion. Then I saw it, a tear forming in the corner of her eye. My mother quickly turned away and pretended to adjust the birthday flowers near the center of the table, hoping nobody would notice. But I noticed, and so did my father. The pain in his expression nearly broke my heart. Jason didn't seem to care. He kept talking, completely unaware of the damage he was causing. Around him, conversations slowly died. The atmosphere shifted. The celebration was gone. In its place was a silence so heavy that it felt impossible to breathe. I gripped the edge of my chair and forced myself to stay calm. Because as cruel as Jason's words were, there was something he didn't know. There was a reason my mother never argued when people underestimated her. There was a reason my family had spent 20 years protecting a secret. And standing there beneath the warm restaurant lights, watching tears gather in my mother's eyes, I realized that secret would not stay hidden much longer. As I sat there watching my mother wipe away a tear she hoped nobody had seen, memories I had spent years trying to bury came rushing back. The truth was that Jason had not suddenly become this person after our divorce. The signs had been there all along. When I first met him, he was charming, ambitious, and confident in a way that seemed inspiring. He talked about goals, growth, and building a future. Back then, I admired his determination. I was working as a project coordinator at a regional consulting firm, and he had recently launched a financial services company with 2 partners. We were both in our early 30s, and it felt like we were building something together. During the first year of our marriage, things were good. We rented a small apartment, shared responsibilities, and spent weekends with my parents. My mother would cook enough food for 10 people even when only 4 of us were coming over. My father would spend hours helping Jason with home improvement projects. They treated him like a son. At first, he seemed grateful. Then success arrived faster than either of us expected. His company landed several major clients within 2 years. Revenue grew. He upgraded his car. We moved into a larger house. New friends entered our lives. They talked about investment portfolios, luxury vacations, and exclusive memberships. The more time Jason spent around them, the more he changed. It started with small comments. He would criticize my father's old pickup truck. He would ask why my mother still clipped coupons from the newspaper. He would joke about how different our families were. Whenever I pushed back, he claimed he was only being honest. Then the comments became judgments. According to Jason, my parents lacked ambition. My brother lacked vision. My cousins lacked discipline. Somehow everyone in my family became an example of what not to be. One Thanksgiving, while my mother was serving dinner, Jason looked around the table and said, "You know, if people here had invested half as much energy into their careers as they do into family gatherings, things might look very different." The room went silent. My father changed the subject. My mother smiled politely. Later that night, I confronted Jason in the car. I told him he had embarrassed everyone. He laughed and said they were too sensitive. That phrase became his favorite defense. Too sensitive. If my father felt disrespected, he was too sensitive. If my mother seemed hurt, she was too sensitive. If I became upset, I was too sensitive. Eventually, I realized that labeling other people's feelings was how Jason avoided accountability for his own behavior. The more successful he became, the less interested he was in understanding anyone else's perspective. By our 7th year of marriage, our relationship felt completely different from the one we had started with. Every conversation became a competition. Every disagreement turned into a lecture. He measured people by income, status, and influence. The qualities my family valued most, loyalty, kindness, and resilience, barely appeared on his list. Looking back, I think the real problem was not money. It was pride. Money simply gave that pride a larger stage. The beginning of the end came during a family barbecue at my parents' house. My father had spent all afternoon preparing the backyard. My mother had cooked for hours. Everyone was having a good time until Jason began discussing business with one of my cousins. When my cousin mentioned that he preferred having a stable job rather than starting his own company, Jason openly mocked the decision. The conversation escalated. My father calmly asked him to let people make their own choices. Instead of backing down, Jason accused my family of encouraging mediocrity. I still remember the look on my mother's face. It was not anger. It was disappointment. She had welcomed him into our family for years, and in that moment, she finally understood how little he respected them. After we left, I told Jason something had to change. He responded by asking why I always chose my family over him. The question shocked me because it revealed how differently we saw the situation. I was not choosing sides. I was asking for basic respect. He saw respect as something earned through achievement. My family believed every person deserved it from the start. The gap between those beliefs grew wider every month. Counseling did not help. Long conversations did not help. Promises did not help. Eventually, we reached a point where staying together caused more pain than separating. The divorce itself was surprisingly quick. Jason treated it like a business transaction. He seemed confident that he was moving toward a better future. During one of our final meetings, he told me something I never forgot. He said, "You will understand one day that I was always trying to push you toward a bigger life." At the time, I was too exhausted to argue. What he failed to understand was that a bigger life and a better life were not always the same thing. After the divorce, I moved into a smaller home and focused on rebuilding. My family stood beside me through every difficult moment. My mother called every morning. My father helped with repairs around the house. My brother showed up whenever I needed support. They never asked for anything in return. Ironically, the people Jason considered unsuccessful became the reason I made it through the hardest chapter of my life. Meanwhile, Jason seemed convinced he had won. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard stories about his expanding business, his expensive purchases, and the glamorous lifestyle he proudly displayed. He rarely missed an opportunity to remind people of his achievements. What he did not know was that my life had begun changing too. Quietly, gradually, in ways he never bothered to notice. And while he spent years looking down on my family, there was one truth none of us had revealed, a truth my parents had protected for decades. That secret had remained hidden through every holiday, every argument, every insult, and every painful moment. But secrets have a way of resurfacing when people become too confident. And Jason was about to make the biggest mistake of his life by underestimating the very people he thought he understood. For most people, secrets feel heavy because they are difficult to carry. In my family, the secret felt heavy because it was difficult to understand. Growing up, I knew there were pieces of our history that were never discussed openly. Certain names would come up and then disappear from conversations. Old photographs sat inside boxes that nobody displayed. My parents were honest people, but there were subjects they carefully avoided. As a child, I never questioned it. As an adult, I became curious. After my divorce, that curiosity slowly turned into determination. My life had become quieter. Without the constant tension that had filled my marriage, I finally had room to think. I spent more time with my parents than I had in years. On Sunday afternoons, I would sit with my mother on her back porch while she watered flowers. Sometimes we talked about ordinary things. Other times we talked about the past. One afternoon, about a year after my divorce, I asked a question I had never asked before. I wanted to know why my parents seemed uncomfortable whenever certain family stories came up. My mother became unusually quiet. She looked toward the yard where my father was trimming a hedge and then back at me. For a moment, I thought she would change the subject. Instead, she said something that immediately caught my attention. She told me there were sacrifices made long before I was born, sacrifices that shaped everything our family became. I asked what she meant. She smiled gently and said I would understand one day. It was not the answer I wanted, but it was enough to tell me that my instincts had been right. There was something important beneath the surface. Over the following months, small pieces began falling into place. My father shared stories about relatives I had never met. My mother mentioned decisions that had changed the direction of multiple lives. None of it seemed connected at first. Then one evening, everything changed. We were sorting through old storage boxes in my parents' garage. Most contained ordinary things: holiday decorations, childhood drawings, faded family albums. Near the back of a shelf sat a weathered box covered in dust. My father froze when he saw it. He stared at it for several seconds before carefully lifting it down. I had never seen that expression on his face before. It was not fear. It was respect. He carried the box inside and placed it on the kitchen table. My mother joined us. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, my father opened the lid. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs dating back decades. Some looked older than anything I had ever seen in our house. My parents exchanged a glance. Then my mother told me it was time for me to know the truth. What followed was not a shocking confession or a dramatic revelation. It was something far more powerful. It was the story of choices. Choices made by people who valued family over recognition, integrity over status, and responsibility over applause. As the pieces came together, I began understanding why my parents never felt the need to impress anyone. They had spent their entire lives protecting something that mattered far more than public approval. Suddenly, countless moments from my childhood made sense. The modest lifestyle, the quiet confidence, the refusal to boast, the patience they showed even when people underestimated them, including Jason, especially Jason. By the end of that evening, I understood something else. If this truth ever became public, it would completely change the way people viewed my family. Yet my parents had never used it to gain admiration or influence. They simply carried it with dignity. Looking back now, that conversation was the beginning of everything that followed. Because while Jason continued building his reputation on appearances, he had no idea that the people he mocked possessed a history he could never have imagined. And before long, circumstances would force that history into the open. The strange thing about arrogance is that it often grows strongest right before reality catches up with it. In the months after my parents revealed the truth about our family history, I began noticing changes around me. Not in my family. They remained exactly the same. My mother still volunteered at community events. My father still spent Saturday mornings helping neighbors with projects. They carried themselves with the same quiet humility they always had. The changes were happening elsewhere. Through mutual friends, I kept hearing rumors about Jason's business. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing dramatic. Just small signs that things were becoming more complicated than they appeared from the outside. A major client had postponed a contract renewal. An expansion project was taking longer than expected. Certain investments had not delivered the results everyone anticipated. None of these issues were unusual in business. Every company faces challenges. But for someone like Jason, challenges were difficult because they threatened the image he had spent years creating. He had built his identity around success. Admitting uncertainty was not something he did well. Whenever people asked how things were going, he gave the same confident answers. Everything was great. New opportunities were coming. Bigger things were ahead. Most people believed him. Some wanted to believe him. Others simply enjoyed being close to someone who appeared successful. Meanwhile, I focused on my own life. After my divorce, I had gradually rebuilt my career. The consulting work I once treated as just a job had evolved into something much larger. New responsibilities led to new opportunities. New opportunities led to partnerships. Those partnerships opened doors I never expected. The difference between Jason and me was that I stopped feeling the need to announce every achievement. Success felt more meaningful when it was not being used to prove something. My family noticed the change too. They often told me I seemed lighter, happier, more confident. For the first time in years, I agreed with them. Then came the charity gala. It was one of the largest fundraising events in our city. Business leaders, local officials, nonprofit organizations, and community figures all attended. Nearly everyone in our social circles received an invitation. I considered skipping it. Large events were never my favorite. But one of my professional partners encouraged me to attend because several important projects would be discussed there. My parents received invitations as well because of their years of community service. We decided to go together. The ballroom was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Conversations blended into a constant hum of voices. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. I spoke with colleagues. My parents chatted with old friends. Then I saw Jason. The moment our eyes met, I knew the evening was about to become uncomfortable. He approached with the same confident smile I remembered from years ago. Beside him stood his girlfriend. Behind them followed a small group of business associates. At first, the conversation remained polite. We exchanged greetings. We discussed the event. We talked about mutual acquaintances. Then one of the guests complimented my parents for their volunteer work. My mother thanked them graciously. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Jason laughed softly. The sound immediately brought back memories of countless uncomfortable family gatherings. He looked around the group and said, "Claire's parents have always been dedicated. If hard work alone determined success, they would probably own half the city by now." Several people forced polite smiles. My father remained calm. My mother simply nodded. I hoped Jason would stop there. He did not. One comment became another, then another. He began telling stories from years earlier, carefully selecting details that made my family appear small, unsophisticated, and unsuccessful. Every story carried the same message. We were ordinary people who lacked the vision to become more. The people around us shifted uncomfortably. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked confused. A few laughed because they did not know what else to do. I felt anger building inside me, but I remembered what my parents had taught me. Emotional control is not weakness. Sometimes it is strength. So I stayed silent and observed. Jason mistook that silence for surrender. He always did. Then he made a mistake. A very big mistake. One of the guests asked my mother how long she had worked at the library. She smiled and said nearly 15 years. Before anyone else could respond, Jason shook his head. "That is commitment," he said. "Most people dream bigger. Margaret prefers staying comfortable." The words landed harder than he realized. My mother's smile faded slightly. Not because she was ashamed, because she understood exactly what he was trying to do. The people closest to her understood too. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my father calmly replied, "There are many ways to measure a life." Jason smiled. "That is true. Some measurements are simply easier to see than others." The group fell silent again. What fascinated me was how completely unaware he seemed. He believed he was winning. He believed he was establishing his superiority in front of an audience. In reality, he was revealing his character. People were not admiring him. They were studying him, judging him, quietly drawing conclusions. Yet he continued. The more he talked, the worse it became. Then a prominent guest approached our group. He was someone widely respected throughout the city. Business leaders listened when he spoke. Community organizations sought his support. Jason immediately straightened his posture. His entire demeanor changed. Suddenly, he became attentive and eager to impress. The man greeted everyone warmly. Then he turned toward my parents. What happened next caught Jason completely off guard. The man's face lit up with genuine respect. He shook my father's hand first. Then he greeted my mother with obvious admiration. It was not the polite respect people show strangers. It was personal, meaningful, familiar. Jason noticed it immediately. Confusion flashed across his face. The man spoke with my parents for several minutes, referencing events, relationships, and history that Jason clearly knew nothing about. When he finally moved on to another conversation, Jason looked unsettled for the first time all evening. I could almost see the questions forming in his mind. Why did someone so influential treat my parents that way? What connection existed that he did not understand? Instead of reflecting on what he had witnessed, Jason doubled down. He made another dismissive comment. Then another. Each one pushed him closer to a truth he was not prepared to face. Standing there beneath the ballroom lights, I realized something important. The secret my parents had protected for decades was no longer safely hidden behind family walls. The circumstances surrounding it were beginning to emerge on their own. Pieces were connecting. Questions were forming. Curiosity was spreading. And if Jason continued behaving exactly as he was, he would soon insult the one person he should never have underestimated. When that happened, everything would change. For the rest of the evening, I watched Jason carefully. Most people would have sensed the shift in the room after the interaction with the respected guest. Most people would have realized they were missing information. Jason was not most people. Instead of becoming more cautious, he became more determined to prove himself right. The confidence he projected looked almost rehearsed, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as everyone else. My parents, meanwhile, remained calm. They continued speaking with guests, thanking donors, and enjoying the event. If they felt hurt by his comments, they refused to let it define their night. That was one of the things I admired most about them. They never allowed another person's opinion to become their identity. About an hour later, dinner concluded and guests began moving toward the main presentation area. Several community leaders were scheduled to speak about future development projects and charitable initiatives. I joined my parents near one of the side tables while people settled into their seats. Then I noticed something unusual. The same influential man who had greeted my parents earlier was speaking with several members of the event board. Every few moments, he glanced toward our table. Eventually, he excused himself and walked directly toward us. Jason noticed immediately. So did several others nearby. The man smiled warmly at my parents. "Margaret, Robert," he said, "there is someone here who would like to see you." My mother's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to recognize surprise. My father looked equally puzzled. "Tonight?" he asked. The man nodded. He insisted. Before either of them could respond, another figure approached. He was older, perhaps in his late 70s, dressed simply despite being one of the most recognizable business leaders in the state. The moment he appeared, conversations around us began to slow. People noticed. Some whispered. Others stared openly. Jason straightened immediately. He clearly recognized him too. What happened next stunned nearly everyone standing nearby. The older gentleman walked directly past several prominent guests and stopped in front of my mother. Then he smiled. "Margaret," he said softly, "it has been far too long." My mother looked genuinely emotional. "Daniel," she replied. "I was not expecting this." The two embraced briefly. My father shook the man's hand. The warmth between them was unmistakable. This was not a casual acquaintance. This was a relationship built over decades. Around us, confusion spread rapidly. People began exchanging questions. How did my parents know him? Why was one of the state's most respected business figures greeting them like family? Jason looked completely lost. I could almost see him trying to reconstruct every assumption he had ever made about my family. None of them fit the scene unfolding in front of him. Then Daniel said something that changed everything. He looked around at the gathering crowd and smiled. "I still tell people that I owe much of my success to this family." The silence that followed felt enormous. Several people laughed nervously, assuming he was joking. He was not. My mother immediately looked uncomfortable. My father shook his head slightly, as though hoping to discourage further discussion. Daniel noticed and smiled. "You always hated attention," he said. "That has not changed." One of the board members stepped closer. "I am sorry," she said. "Have we been missing an incredible story all these years?" Daniel laughed softly. "Most definitely." My mother tried to redirect the conversation. "Tonight is about the charity," she said. "Not us." But the moment had already taken on a life of its own. People were gathering. Questions were spreading. Curiosity was impossible to stop. Daniel glanced at my parents. After a brief pause, my father nodded. It was a small gesture, but I understood its meaning. After decades of silence, they were finally ready. Daniel turned toward the group. 40 years ago, he began, I was a young entrepreneur with more ambition than resources. I had a promising idea and almost no support. Banks rejected me. Investors walked away. Most people assumed I would fail. He paused. Most people except Robert and Margaret. The room became completely still. They believed in me when almost nobody else did. They risked something valuable to help me continue when others would not. Someone asked what they had done. Daniel smiled. Enough to change my life. My mother looked down. My father folded his hands quietly. Daniel continued. The company I eventually built became successful. More successful than any of us imagined. Years later, when I offered to repay them in ways far beyond the original commitment, they refused. Audible murmurs spread through the crowd. They told me the same thing they always said. If you are fortunate enough to succeed, help someone else. That was their condition. The room remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Then Daniel revealed the detail that changed everything. What most people do not know is that several community foundations, scholarship programs, and local development projects that transformed this region can trace their origins back to that decision. More whispers followed. Faces shifted from curiosity to astonishment. People were beginning to understand. My parents had never sought recognition. They had never attached their names to buildings. They had never advertised their contributions. They had simply allowed others to receive the credit. For decades, one guest asked the question everyone was thinking. Why keep that private? My mother finally answered. Because helping people was never supposed to be a performance. The simplicity of her response hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. Across the room, I saw Jason standing completely motionless. For years, he had measured worth through visible achievements. Expensive homes, titles, revenue, public status. Yet the people he dismissed as ordinary had quietly influenced lives across generations without asking for applause. Then came the final revelation. Daniel looked toward me and smiled. And before anyone asks, yes, Claire knows the full story now. Several heads turned in my direction. I nodded. Not for very long, I admitted. They kept it hidden from almost everyone. Daniel laughed. That sounds exactly like them. Then he added something I will never forget. The greatest lesson they ever taught me was that character matters long after recognition fades. The words seemed to settle over the room. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. The atmosphere had completely changed. My parents had not won people over through power or wealth. They had won through integrity. That was something Jason had never understood. For years he believed he was looking down at them. In reality, he had been looking up without realizing it. The expression on his face told me everything. Shock, embarrassment, disbelief, regret. He finally understood that the story he had spent years telling himself was wrong. And for the first time since I had known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. The gala ended differently than anyone had expected. Conversations continued long after the final presentation, but the tone had changed completely. People who had barely noticed my parents earlier now approached them with genuine respect. Not because of money, not because of influence, because they had finally learned the truth about the kind of people Robert and Margaret Bennett had always been. My mother handled the attention the same way she handled everything else in life, with grace. She thanked people for their kind words and quickly redirected praise toward others. My father did the same. Watching them that night reminded me why the secret had remained hidden for so long. Recognition had never been the goal. Character had. As guests began leaving, I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the river. The evening air felt cool and calm after the energy inside. For a few minutes, I stood alone and reflected on everything that had happened. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I already knew who it was. Jason stopped a few feet away. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. The confidence that had always surrounded him seemed gone. He stared out at the water before finally speaking. I did not know, he said quietly. I nodded. No, you did not. He lowered his eyes. I was wrong about your family. There was a time when hearing those words would have meant everything to me. Years earlier, I had wanted him to understand what made my family special. I had wanted him to appreciate their kindness, their sacrifices, and their values. But standing there that night, I realized something surprising. I no longer needed his approval. Yes, I replied. You were. He took a deep breath. I wish I could change a lot of things. I believed him. Regret was written all over his face. But regret and change are not the same thing. Some lessons arrive only after opportunities have passed. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question that revealed more than he probably intended. How did I never see it? I smiled slightly. Because you were looking for the wrong things. He looked away. I think he understood exactly what I meant. After a moment, he wished me well and walked back toward the building. That was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. In the months that followed, life continued moving forward. My parents returned to their normal routines. The attention eventually faded, just as they knew it would. But the respect remained. As for me, I carried something far more valuable than vindication. I carried perspective. The people Jason once dismissed had taught me the greatest lesson of my life. Real worth is not measured by applause, titles, or appearances. It is measured by the lives you touch when nobody is watching. Looking back now, I do not remember the insults nearly as much as I remember the response. My family never fought for recognition. They simply lived with integrity until the truth spoke for itself. And in the end, that truth proved stronger than any opinion ever could.